Hi there, and welcome on the journey to transform culture. I'm Steve, and today I'll be guiding our conversation. Folks, I hope you're having a fantastic day and an even better week. Today, folks, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to have a centralized organizational structure and a decentralized organizational structure. To keep it simple, because I don't want to get into the depths and the weeds too much to confuse anybody, a centralized organizational structure, if you imagine like a corporate office and then you have, we'll say a half dozen or more sites that are spread out amongst different states or locations, that would be a centralized organizational structure in so much as the primary support for resources, for hiring or recruiting or engineering support and all that for all the sites are pretty much housed at that central location, right? And that might be where your CEO or president, et cetera, reside. And then at your level, you have more like your GM or your plant leadership and so forth, right? And so there's that side of the house. Then there's the side of the house where it's decentralized, right? Decentralized is where you have all of these folks who are, in my previous example, at the central location as a support hub. Now they're out at the individual sites. You may have less of them. You may have one or two, right? Where in the other example, you have them all kind of congregated at one location, potentially. So you can see there's kind of a couple methods, right? And then you might have a hybrid mix in there as well. But there's some sneaky little things that happen and little things that trip us up when we think about these and how they came to be. If you went back in time, many organizations had quite a bureaucracy, and it looked very pyramid setup, where you had a lot of bureaucracy, right? People moving papers from this desk to that and that to the next and so on. I'm using that as an example. But there are many different aspects of people in the process, in the organization, who really weren't providing value as much as it was non-value support, right? And over time, what organizations, larger ones primarily, realized that, wow, we've got a lot of waste. How come and why do we have all this waste? Well, we've got a lot of excess. So we have people who are hired to do a job and they've got, an assistant to do this and the assistant has an assistant to do that and so on, right? Kind of that minutia, the bureaucracy, right? You're not doing your own job. Now you've hired 3 people to do your job. What are you doing, right? So in all of this analysis, going back in time, they figured out, wait, we just need to have people who can do their own job. We don't need people who need 3 other people to do their job, right? And obviously there can be exceptions, but not to a vast extent, right? So they go, oh, okay, well, let's make these organizations less pyramidal and let's make it a flat organizational structure, right? And seeing this, they thought, oh, well, this is going to save us a lot of money, right? This will save us a lot of overhead, a lot of operational overhead, and so forth. So we'll flatten it out. And by doing that, and then we'll pull, some of these functions to that centralized location, right? So where that pyramid may have been more site level, now you have it more at the corporate level. Okay. So at the site level, they've got this flat organizational structure. Their main thought is, oh, this is saving us a lot of overhead. But what has occurred, and does occur, is now you may have started with that and thought, oh, well, we can make a lot of money doing this. We can, we've got a lot of extra money, or we can invest, we can do this, we can grow. And initially that might have been pretty exciting. But what they didn't see coming was the damage to organizational culture that occurs. It's a feast or famine scenario now, because where before you had support at the site level, now you have the sites dependent on the say, corporate main office where, and the folks that are assigned to it to, for our resources, for our hiring and training and all the things. And if you have multiple sites, what do you think the response time is when folks are juggling many different things? Because do you think that they pulled everybody up to that central location when they did that? No, they didn't. They thinned that out too. Because why? Well, we can trim our costs back and we'll just work a little bit harder. Now, in the general scheme, working a little bit harder is fine. Again, it was a feast or famine. Before, people weren't having to really press themselves. Now people have to press themselves. And so any contrast to what they were doing before would felt like starvation, even the change of everything. And that is true. But what also became from this as time wore on going forward is a cultural dynamic where the folks who are hiring for leadership and team members and support staff and so forth at the individual sites now trying to keep their costs in control, which, okay, fine, started skimping on some of this stuff, right? So if we aren't developing our employees, if we aren't training and developing our employees, if we're not standardized, and if all of the key things that are required to be in an organization to make them capable of doing this in a flat organizational culture, and by flat, we mean you might have a site leader, some functionals, right, and then under a few of them, you might have your broader employment pool, right? So, or employee pool. 2 or 3 different production and so forth and so on, right? So it's not 100% flat. Now, there are small organizations where it is 100% flat. And that's even more of a challenge, right? Because what it means is when you go to a flat organizational culture or organizational setup is that you are essentially saying, well, before people were about 60%, competent or effective. You choose your wordage, your verbiage there, okay? Now we need above 90%. And why is that? Because I need everybody to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And not only that, I also need them to be able to ride a bike and all the things. I need them to be multifaceted, right? But the problem is getting multifaceted leaders and hiring team members that are multifaceted isn't easy. And that there's truth there. But because it's not easy and I don't do that, what happens? If I bring in folks who aren't site leaders, for example, and or their functional support staff, who aren't able to lead and mentor their teams and coach them along and develop them and do all the important things, if they're not capable of doing that, what do you think happens? Well, productivity drops, the morale drops, the overall organizational culture is sinking slowly into the sand, right? Your turnover is increased. What does that mean? Well, now you've inflated your corporate costs to HR and, and your recruiting side of the house to replace all the people you're losing. And what you don't realize is that you've got leaks in your boat, right? You got all these leaky spots and you haven't addressed it. And what happens is we have this situation where we left the sites afloat or adrift, say on a boat with no fuel to go anywhere, and you have the site team there, and they realize they don't have the appropriate resources and so on and so forth, and they're not doing well. They're not getting anywhere, right, with not enough resources to move this boat. And so now their next thing is well, who do we throw out of the boat next? So as their productivity, quality, and all the things start to kind of implode here and there, and it starts to become problematic. And I hate to chuckle, but it's just kind of the truth, folks. And this is what you see. What is the initial reaction, do you think, for the overall company in the situation? Well, we're going to raise our prices. We have a price increase because we have to make up for what? All these overhead costs, because we're not really getting to the meat of the matter. And the meat of the matter is essentially is that you've left your sites adrift, and now it's the employees' fault that we're not producing, for a couple of years, and then the shoe flips to the other side. Oh, it's the site leader or some functional leadership that aren't doing, they're not doing well, etc. And so you get this revolving door. Well, it ends up being that you've got folks on this boat who are basically playing the blame game, right? Even if it's not overt, it's subtle, right? It could be very covert, right? And and so you've got this going on, and so that doesn't help retention either because word spreads because word does, and and next thing you know, you've got this whole dynamic of this negative ebb and flow. And now all of this seeps its way up to your corporate level, right? To your centralized hub. And those folks now become playing the blame game at different sites and people in those sites. Why? So it's never them, it's always somebody at a site. See how this goes? And you've just basically created a mess. You've created an absolute mess. And so it's a tricky thing to go from, we'll say site centralized to a decentralized, right? You want decentralized. It does make sense, and it is more efficient to be more central or decentralized. You want those sites to have autonomy and do what they need to do, and to be able to react very tactically and quickly for the customer. But it requires you to have better than 90% competence, right? And it goes beyond competence. There's got to be a drive and kind of a, the care factor has to be high, right? You can't have folks, essentially you have your site should be seen like special ops team, right? You're not going to drag anybody in off the street to be on your special ops team, right? You're just not. Okay. You need to go and you need to take the time and be very deliberate. Now, what you can do is make sure that your leader and your support team are, because folks like that will be able to mentor, train, develop your programs, and so on. And if you don't have very good, if you're not standardized well enough, say each site produces something different, does different work, right? Has a different scope of work overall. Well, naturally, there's going to be some things that are variants, but for the most part, how your team communicates and all the things that should be in your O plan, how you deal with the what if scenarios, right? What's your risk management? All these things. All of this stuff should be standardized so that way that can carry a lot of the load of somebody having to constantly go back and say, hey, because we didn't standardize. Hey, you didn't do this, this wasn't done correctly. Well, this is the way I've always done it. Yeah, but X, Y, Z. Well, if your processes were set up in such a way and your process procedures, right, your standard work, all these things are set up in such a way that they're repeatable, right? Do you really need to have your site leader hanging over your shoulder or even the functional leaders hanging over your shoulder to get something done or to verify and validate, right? You may have a cross-functional process that handles that, right? You may have a QA or whatever in-house. You may have people who are doing cross-functional or dual role, right? Quality and safety person, for example. So you may have some things like that make sense, right? So where they can accomplish the work and make sure quality's good, everybody's being safe, and they're at hand. But do you need the rest of the functional team and everybody micromanaging? No. And your broader team doesn't want that either. They just want mechanisms in place so that, hey, what do I do when X, right? Because if you have employees, this is a good little exercise as well. Hey, if you have questions about something and you don't know, for example, hey, what do we do when this happens or that happens or whatever? Write all these questions down because these are questions you shouldn't have to react to these questions when they actually occur or come up. These should be things you address, right? And then your broader employee pool, they can go to your O plan and say, oh, okay, I see. This is what it says here, right? So as they are reading through it and they're understanding it, and do you have them just read it and then that's it, and then just sits in a binder somewhere on a shelf and that's it? No, it's a living referenceable document. This houses how you handle things, what the expectations are, and the details within that, right? For those folks who don't have a quality manual, your O plan can serve as your quality manual if you write it correctly. And so On the one hand, yes, it makes sense from an effectiveness and efficiency, I should say, from an efficiency standpoint, to have decentralization. But, some functions, right? You're just ballooning some functions at the corporate level. You don't need to balloon HR. Your HR, you can have HR support where you're at. Your managers can hire and do interviews, right? If they can't, there's one of your issues, one of the boxes to work on and check off once you're done. Get your managers up to speed. They should be able to guide somebody right through through the process of onboarding. You shouldn't have to have an HR do everything. I mean, fine, but you're front loading your support functions. You're front loading your support functions in one area and starving them at another, right? And the result is that it's not effective. The support isn't effective. The communication's not effective. The reaction times are likely ineffective or delayed. When I say ineffective, folks are having to wait a couple days to follow up with the customer because of a certain sign off or administrative function that needs to be done. That's non-value added, folks. What non-value added processes can you standardize that make that referenceable to the broader team so that you can now come up with ways to accomplish that in a more efficient, effective way? You can do brainstorming sessions and you can come up with solutions to your what ifs, right? All right, folks, just a short one today. Organizations that opt for a flat org culture or a flat organizational structure have to realize that you can't just snap your fingers and get to a flat organizational structure, that you have to invest some time, money, and so forth to train, to bring on board effective leaders who are capable of coaching, mentoring, and creating that within your functional support staff. And they have to be folks who can learn as well, right? You can't be a great leader if you aren't a great learner, in the sense that you have a desire to learn and grow. If you don't have that, then you don't have the makeup and the chemistry to create a great site organizational culture at particular sites. And it may be that you have to accomplish this site by site, but it's worth the investment, because then you see your turnover start to drop. You see a lot of these things start to kind of subside, and then you see the culture start to come back in and the morale start to pick back up, and people start to pick up the pace, and they start to fill the gaps where you did have, right? You need to put the resources that you have at hand, you need to make those folks part of your solution, the process to finding solutions within your sites and your broader organization. You've got all the answers, or at least 95% of them are floating around in the minds and the hearts of everybody you have on your team already. But we get into this proximity breeds contempt scenario where we invalidate in our own mind the people who we see every day because we pigeonholed them and put them in a box. Well, they just do this and they can't contribute beyond that. Nonsense. You've got people who've probably been on your team for a year, 2, 3, 5, 10, that you've never really got sat down with and really mined out what they feel and what they think would be a great approach or something they've come up with. Who cares if some creative responses are maybe exotic or a little bit out there? Hey, have fun with the process. The fact that you have anyone contribute is a win, and take that as a win, even if you don't use an idea. But by goodness, make sure to incorporate ideas that people give you and give them the credit for those ideas. Never throw an idea away or brush somebody away because the idea is a bit exotic. Maybe that exotic idea and solution becomes something that you evolve to. Maybe it's an exotic idea for somebody who's really living in the past when it comes to organizational structures and how we do things. If we're caught up in with, well, that's not the way we do things around here, that's how you can identify and diagnose right off the get-go that you've got a problem. You've got a problem. If your response or anybody in your team's response is as well, that's not how we do it here, and this kind of approach or this language. This language is indicative of and a response to closed-mindedness. And you need to open up your mind if you're going to be creative enough to collaborate and find solutions. All right, folks, that's going to be it for today. If you're going to have a decentralized structure, make sure you're doing the correct thing to develop your teams and onboard folks who are capable, right, in a multifaceted way to lead your team. If you're not, then you're cycling through leaders, you're cycling through team members, you have turnover, you've got poor culture, you've got a cascade of failure going on. And it may be happening right underneath what appears to be calmness within the overall structure. Why? Because you're you're centralized away at a different location. All right, folks. Hope you have a fantastic day. Remember to hit like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, we'll talk to you later.